We may begin, Dr. Pawlik.
Okay, thank you, Aido. All right. So, hello, a warm welcome and greetings from the DSA-ASIA laboratory. Thank you all for your interest in our archaeology webinar series and for joining us today for another exciting talk on the deep human history. As always, this webinar is jointly facilitated by Aido Balboa, Dr. Riczar Fuentes, and myself. This webinar series is supported by the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and its members, the School of Social Sciences, Areté, the Creativity and Innovation Hub of the Ateneo de Manila University, and the Eduardo J. Aboitiz Sandbox Zone. Today, we have the great pleasure to have Graeme Barker of the University of Cambridge as our speaker. Dr. Barker is one of the most influential and eminent archaeologists of our time, whose excavations in the Nia caves in Sarawak, for example, have significantly influenced and shaped modern archaeology, particularly in Southeast Asia. Graeme Barker is Disney Professor of Archaeology Emeritus at the University of Cambridge, a Senior Research Fellow in the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research, and a Professorial Fellow at St. John's College in Cambridge. He was Senior Lecturer at the University of Sheffield from 1972 to 1984, then the Director of the British School at Rome from 1984 to 1988, Professor of Archaeology from 1988 to 2004, the head of the School of Archaeology, then Graduate Dean and Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of Leicester. And in 2004, he was appointed Disney Professor of Archaeology and served as a director at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at Cambridge until 2014. Graeme Barker was elected a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London in 1979, a Fellow of the British Academy in 1999, and Commander of the British Empire in the Queen's New Year's Honours for 2015 for his services to archaeology. Graeme has published over 25 books and 350 research papers, and the focus of his research can broadly be described as human landscapes, the relations, both short and long-term, between people and environment in the past, an interest he has pursued in different ecologies, temperate, semi-arid, arid, and rainforest, and with societies at different levels of complexity, from Neanderthals and early modern humans to present-day rainforest farmers and foragers in Borneo. The origins and early history of agriculture farming were a particular focus for many years, but more recently, his interests have also turned to the behaviors that underpin the successful dispersals of Homo sapiens from Africa across Eurasia and Australasia 100 to 50,000 years ago. He has led interdisciplinary fieldwork teams in Italy, Libya, Jordan, and of course, Malaysia and Sarawak with the Nia Cave project that has resulted in numerous research papers and 2 outstanding monographs, and currently Iraqi Kurdistan and Shanidar Cave. Dear Graeme, thank you very much for being with us today, and I now turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfred. Thank you, Riczar, for introducing me so nicely. It's a great pleasure to be there. For those of you who don't know, I'm sitting in a dark early morning Cambridge. So if I see the title of the paper, as I said, I'm talking about Neanderthals and the work that we've been doing at Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan. And there's the cave you can see on the hillside in spring. This is, I'll just take it through. I'll give a little bit of background and then take us through the original excavations at Shanidar and the discovery of the Neanderthals and their significance, the debates about them, and then what we've been doing so far, and then summary findings, and where we're going from there. So a bit of background, as Alfred was saying, one main interest of mine for a long time, it started with my PhD, which is on Italian prehistory. It's been on the transitions from hunting, gathering, foraging to farming. And a big article for my PhD was published in the book on the left, Paleoeconomy, by my PhD supervisor, Eric Higgs. And then they're the sort of books you can see, prehistoric farming, agricultural revolution, and so on. So that's been one interest. And then, and operationalizing that, you can see the kind of field projects, as you mentioned. These are sort of multidisciplinary projects looking at landscape development, but in particular, often agriculture processes were an important theme of those. And that was what took me originally to the Near Caves in Borneo, which is the first of two books you see on the bottom right, because it had real potential to contribute to our understanding about transitions from foraging to farming in island Southeast Asia. But that took me, although I've written about pre-Neolithic, Mesolithic, and Paleolithic archaeology in various times in the past, it was really that near work that pushed me in this latter part of my career back into deeper prehistory. And it led to, therefore, an interest in this question about why is our species, why have we been so successful? Because we developed from being an African species to a global species. And what you see there is a totally simplified map. I mean, Near Cave is actually on there. Let's go back. So it was, I mean, it's a very simplified map. And of course, now we populate it not just with Neanderthals as well, but Flores and of course the Homo lucenensis and so on. So it's made it even more interesting. Why are none of these other species there? Why just us? And that led to that interest. The work on the Near Caves raised that, because the questions there were clearly, how are our species adapted successfully, unsuccessfully to living in rainforest? And following that, I led many of the same people. It's a group of archaeologists and geographers and other specialists, but they're the main group. We've been excavating the Hafatir cave in Libya, you see there. And that was from the Near Cave work, the field work was 2000 to 2003. The Hafatir work was 2007 to about 2014, 15, and Shanidar cave started in 2014. There never was, a grand plan to go and to work on these three caves, but it just sort of happened over the years. But following this overarching interest in the adaptability of our species to different sorts of landscapes, different environments, and they were all caves which had been excavated in the 50s and 60s. They were all caves with deep stratigraphies that took us into the Pleistocene. So the Near Caves were excavated by Tom and Barbara Harrison in the 50s up through into the 60s. The Hafatir cave was excavated by the Cambridge prehistorian Charles McBurney in the 1950s, and Shanidar cave was excavated by Frank Salecki between 1950-51 and 1960. I said there never was a grand plan, but they are three iconic sites from the work by these early excavators, and they were all for their way ahead of their time, respectively. So that takes us to Shanidar cave. You can see its location. It's at the very top corner of modern Iraq in the semi-autonomous state of Iraqi Kurdistan. It's near the border with Turkey and near the border with Iran. You can see the mountains in the distance from near the cave. And that gives you a sense, on the left, we're looking up to the cave in spring, and then from the cave, looking down to the Greater Zab River. And you see how green it is in spring, and the same shots in the autumn. Sorry, in the summer when it's burnt dry. So the cave's about say 700-800 meters. There are much higher mountains up on the borders, but it's a highland cave. So our Salecki conducted these amazing excavations. He had about 5 seasons of them. Iraqi Kurdistan was huge logistical difficulties at that time in terms of transport, communications, and so on. And he saw the prospects of what he assumed would be a deep occupation sequence, looking at the cave and the talus, the stuff thrown outside it. It was being lived in at the time it was occupied every winter by transhumant shepherds who would come down from the high mountains with their sheep and goats, and they were living in the cave. And so what he did was to excavate a single large trench down the middle of the cave, and it went down to about 14 meters. And you can see it was broadly a long rectangle, but he also excavated, you see the bulge on the side, what we've called the eastern extension. And then you can see also there's a deep sounding in the main trench. He had to employ and train a whole series of local workmen. Amazing, huge logistical problems and wonderful solutions, including dynamite for some of the massive rocks that he had to deal with. And he ended up with this summary sequence that has been reproduced again and again. And you can see he defined 4 main levels, A, B, C, and D. And D was Middle Paleolithic Mousterian archaeology, and Mousterian given the name after the European Middle Paleolithic, which in Europe was associated with Neanderthals. Above that, his level C was stone industries that were of Upper Paleolithic type, like the Aurignacian in Europe, which in Europe were associated with Homo sapiens. And he gave it the name from the local mountains, Baradostian. And then above that, he had occupation, you can see there, Mesolithic, Proto-Neolithic, and right up to recent. So he had this deep stratigraphy. And he found the bones of around 10 Neanderthal individuals. You can see they're marked. He had sort of upper ones and lower ones. So Shanidar 1, 3, 5 are these upper ones. And then the lower ones, you can see Shanidar 2 and the child, and Shanidar 4 and 6 and so on. So those groups, then what he thought was a stalagmite layer there. So broadly, it seemed an extraordinarily important sequence of an occupation by Neanderthal people. Then he thought there was a 10,000-year hiatus, and then the occupation by our own species, Homo sapiens. And the dating at that time, as with all the other, as with Near Cave and the Halfater Cave, the only method of dating available was radiocarbon dating. That took you back at the time to around 40,000 years ago, 40, 45, 50 at the extreme. So all 3 caves, they ended up with a pioneering series of radiocarbon dates for down to 40,000, 45,000. And anything below that, any age of the sediments had to be estimated from estimates of ideas about sort of rates of sediment accumulation. And in the case of Shanidar, he thought it might go back to around 100,000 years ago, but that was, say, beyond any dating that he'd got. And therefore, you can see the Shanidar, the upper burials, were at the sort of limits of radiocarbon dating. The lower burials were just, beyond dating. The Neanderthals, I said, in the end, he found we found 10. The Shanidar 1 was extraordinary because it was massively injured. You can see a part of an arm was missing, the head was bashed in. It's thought that he was an adult male, must have been, I mean, sort of semi-deaf, semi-blind, couldn't possibly have hunted for himself. And yet he died much later than those injuries. And so that, therefore, obviously raised the question that he must have been looked after by the community. So it's cited as one of the first examples of compassion in the history of humanity. And one of the other bodies had a rib had got a wound mark that they thought was from a projectile. So if you like, again, evidence for violence, contrasting with compassion. The most extraordinary burial is number 4. Remember, one of those lower burials. The sediment from around the burial was collected by Salecki and sent to Arlette Leroy-Gourand, a very eminent pollen analyst in France. And she looked at the pollen and identified a whole series of flowers in it. And she went through various arguments about how the flowers might have got there, whether it was just ordinary pollen rain, whether burrowing animals could have brought the pollen down. She went through these, but she decided, because of the nature of the pollen, the clusters of flowers, so she decided in the end that a reasonable explanation was that the Neanderthal body had been buried with flowers, and the flower burial has become absolutely iconic. And Salecki wrote a wonderful book about the whole project, and this was in the early 70s. The title is you can see there, Shanidar, the first flower people. He thought that some of the bodies had been killed by rockfall, and that some of them, like Shanidar 4, were true burials with indications of grave markers. So the Shanidar burials have been hugely important in Neanderthal studies and much debated ever since. His interpretations, the rock burial, the rock falls, the deliberate burials with some kind of rituals and so on. So just a bit of background about Neanderthals. See here, we've known about them since 1856. The name comes from the discovery in the Neander Valley in Germany. They were a species that we now know extended from the Atlantic on the west all the way across to the Ural Mountains, and from Germany right the way down to, well, Shanidar Cave is one of the southernmost, was thought. And you can see there the origins, the antiquity, again, much debated from the fossil record, but 400,000 years ago, even 500,000 years ago. So, and they've then disappeared about 40,000 years ago. So they're a species, therefore, that extended over a huge part of the world and survived for a very long period, but they die out around 40,000. They have, of course, had a century of bad press. When people talk about somebody being Neanderthal, it isn't normally suggesting that they're a particularly artistic, gentle character. And these are typical images that we've seen through the time. They have had a much better press in recent decades, and in many ways, Shanidar Cave, the discoveries by Ralph Salecki, were an important part of that recognition, that whole idea of the first flower people and so on. So Shanidar and other sites have had much disputed evidence of whether Neanderthals did bury their dead. Some people have argued that, well, if they did bury their dead, they were just putting the bodies away to keep them away from animals. But others have said, no, that sites like Shanidar do indicate that they were burials as we would understand them in terms of funerary rites. That evidence for caring for the sick, which is Shanidar, evidence for their use of symbols, a whole variety of evidences for there, and now evidence also for making different kinds of art. And the more we know about their subsistence systems, again, the more that it isn't simply kind of opportunistic hunting. And then here you see some images of some 21st century Neanderthals dressed today. So Shanidar's Shanidar Cave, the discoveries by Salecki have been an important part of that rethinking, much debated rethinking, about how similar or different were Neanderthals to our species. And of course, genetically, we now know that there were degrees of interbreeding between them. And so they are our closest evolutionary cousins. And so Shanidar Cave clearly had potential to contribute to these debates about the nature of Neanderthals and, of course, to the question about why they disappear. So why go back to Shanidar Cave? Because really quite out of the blue, I think in 2011, I was approached by the Iraqi Kurdistan government with an invitation to go back to re-excavate Shanidar Cave, which is an extraordinary offer. Many people had wanted to go back, of course. It's such an iconic site, and people had always said, no, no, no. So when we had the invitation, we'd have had to raise the money for funding fieldwork. And so shaping the grant proposals, we were therefore saying, why should we go back? Well, the first question was could we date in the way that Salecki couldn't, when the Neanderthals were there, thinking of that stratigraphy I showed you. When were they there? When were they first there? When were they last there? When were modern humans there? Because Salecki hadn't found any modern human fossil remains. He'd only found the fossil remains of Neanderthals. So again, these questions about when were modern humans there? What were they doing there, the Neanderthals and the modern humans, in terms of their life ways, all the things that we can do now that weren't then? I mean, the study of things like use wear, the kind of things that Alfred does, use wear on lithics, and the residues, organic residues attached to lithics. You can think of all the manner of the archaeological science that's developed since the 1950s. In particular, the big question we thought was, could we try to reconstruct how they were living, and indeed, possibly this question of dying, and could we address, could we contribute, because this cave had Neanderthals and modern humans, could we contribute to the debate about why did Neanderthals disappear? As you can see at the bottom, it's a simplified chart of global temperatures changing over the last 120-odd thousand years of the marine isotope stages. And you can see MIS1 on the right is the present day climate. And the climate around 100,000 years ago was rather similar. These are global climates. But there's been this huge jagged change, so that the period of the last 150,000 years is going to be characterized by enormous climatic change, in particular trends to aridity and cold, the ice ages, but punctuated, you can see, by the zigzag pattern of climate change. And one of the arguments was that perhaps the climate change around 40,000 years ago, 50 to 40,000, was so extreme and so sudden that it was suggested that perhaps that was the clinching factor for why Neanderthals disappeared then, because it's about the same time that modern humans are expanding. I mean, modern humans are probably coming out of Africa at least by 120,000 in that in this globally milder period, MIS5. And as you'll know, they're in Southeast Asia, 60,000, and in Australia the same sort of time, 60, 65,000, in Siberia, in Japan at 40,000. So across that, our own species has proved, say, extraordinarily successful, expanding over the globe at this time of extraordinary climate change, and yet Neanderthals disappear at 40,000. And so one of the debates was, was climate an important part? And one of the problems for all the debates about the influence of climate is we know a lot about global climate change from deep sea cores and from cores through the ice caps in the Arctic, resulting in that kind of climate chart that you can see there. But of course, what we need to try to do is try to reconstruct, in this case, what was climate and environment and landscape actually like at the scale that Neanderthals had to grasp. So we have to then try and take these site caves, which are repositories also of paleo-environmental indicators, and try to reconstruct what the landscape, the climate, the environment was like at that time. So we can then try to take the evidence for how they were living in a cave, the hunting, the gathering, fishing, whatever's going on. And then we can contrast that with local climatic records. And that was basically the shape of the project that we proposed to the funders. The prime funder first was the Leverhulme Foundation, with very little expectation of finding more Neanderthals. We had assumed that the Salecki excavations had removed most of the evidence. So the project started in 2014, but also had to stop that summer because of the ISIS threats across that region. So we started in 2015. We're doing about a month's fieldwork a year, sometimes on 2 episodes a year. And as you can see, you can see there top left what the site looked like when we first visited it. And you can see it sort of slumping in the ground where the Salecki Trench had been. And so we decided to concentrate on that eastern extension area, because that's where he'd found most of the Neanderthals. Because you can see the eastern extension in 1960, that the black and white photograph. You can see Shanidar 1, that badly injured individual, that was the location he found it. 5 and 3 on the other side of that eastern extension. And then going down into his deep sounding, the flower burial, you can see the figures with the white hat is down by the excavation of Shanidar 4, the flower burial. And so what we did was empty out the backfill from that side of the Salecki Trench. And much of it had fallen in. It was never fully backfilled at the end, because Salecki was aiming to go back in 1960, but he went back to the rest house, the base, but he wasn't allowed to excavate for political uncertainties and reasons. And so he was never able to finish the excavation. So he was never able to go back and backfill the trench properly, which, for example, was the case in Areté. People were living in the cave, things gradually fell in, rubbish was thrown in, and so on. Anyway, you see there by how we got down by about 2018 and 2019. And we've got down about 10 meters, and we think the deepest part that we've got to is around, and probably the base layer that we've got in a small sounding, the bottom right. You can see the arrow running across, is that so-called stalagmite layer. Probably isn't stalagmite, but we think we can see the same thing that Salecki got to. You can see, so that's where we've got to. There's still several meters lower down that we haven't managed to get to. The big picture on the left, you can see that's looking out of the cave, and the main area of the excavations is that eastern extension. And then the figures down the bottom are down in the Shanidar 4 area in the deep sounding. So what we've done, we've exposed the sections, we've cleaned them, we've applied a whole range of dating, radiocarbon dating and OSL dating, sediment dating, which of course has got a much deeper reach than radiocarbon dating. And we've tried to get as much information that we can about climate and environment and human activity at the time, from looking at the sediments in great detail, and also taking micromorphology samples, where you take a block of sediment and you end up with a glass slide through it, which you can look at in the laboratory. We've been sampling for environmental DNA, which it's being worked on in Copenhagen by Estes Villesef's team, who's also a colleague in my own Cambridge College, because if it works and conditions are not good for survival, most of the successful environmental DNA, like ancient DNA sampling, has come from the very cold northern regions, Alaska, Siberia. But if it would work, then of course it could be an indicator of finding Neanderthal DNA and modern human DNA, and of course as the other animals and so on that are around. We've also cut sample columns, just little 30 by 30 centimeter columns down through the exposed walls of the trenches to get bulk samples of all the indicators. So we've been getting a PhD student of mine, Emily Tilby, is looking at the microfauna, the little mice and so on, as a record of local environment change within the cave. There's a whole series of proxies like that, isotope studies, pollen studies, and so on. And we've also done larger excavations in a couple of places, and then, as is the norm with all of these sites, everything that it doesn't go in a bag or a tube back for analysis, or all the sediment you excavate is washed and searched through for all the tiny finds, including things like that tiny microfauna that Emily is working on. We also I was able to go back and visit Ralph Salecki. Ralph died a couple of years ago in his early 100s. So when I met him, he was around 100, late 90s, living outside New York. And in fact, when I was first invited to work in the cave, I immediately contacted him and broadly asked for his blessing. He was enormously supportive. Anyway, in that 2014 year, when the work was cancer cause of ISIS, I first went over to meet him and his wife, Rose, who was also an excellent archaeologist who worked closely with him, but her interest was more on the Neolithic transition period. And he'd given a lot of his archive to the Smithsonian, but he'd still also got a lot of the archive, extraordinary rich notebooks and general survey work in the house outside New York. All of that now has been given by his family to the Smithsonian. So the most of the finds, a few of them are in Columbia University where he was attached to, but most of the finds are in the Smithsonian, and also now all of the Salecki records, the excavations. So we've been doing a certain amount of work on those archives and on the materials there. So this is therefore a kind of looking east, if you like, it's a schematic of that eastern extension. And you can see a simplified geological, geomorphological sequence down the side. And the column samples, again, shown schematically. And the two grey areas are the areas where we've been working. See that, yeah, so what you have here is the schematic of the geology with broadly, you see huge rockfall areas with different kinds of sediments in between. And then the column samples that we've been digging, and then we've had a larger area of excavation here and a larger area of excavation there. And what I'm going to do, basically, is just to go down in the summary, just go down through these through this sequence to give you some of the results. The top of the sequence up here, broadly, we're dealing at this 20-odd thousand years ago, the last glacial maximum, the extreme conditions, and we haven't found anything. These rocks probably date to that period, these massive rocks here, and it just looks like the cave was too marginal to use. The later archaeology that Salecki found was further over in the entrance, in the back part of the cave. And then we move to the further down, the Upper Paleolithic sequence. Now, I've put modern human with a question mark because we haven't found fossils, just like Salecki haven't. So there are no modern human bones yet found, which is why, therefore, the environmental DNA it'd be wonderful if it came up with any indicators of what species are there when. But you can see we're talking about this part of the cave now, and you can see these schematically shown bands. Well, these are bands of ash, and you can see what they're running around here, and these are another very, very slim layers of ash in the cave. And if we take one of them, they're little hearths, they're single-use hearths. I mean, just people coming along basically lighting a barbecue. Very small single-use hearths. It's not where people are going back to a hearth, repeating. And you can see there, that's the block of sediment I've taken out, and that's finally the thin section from it. And what they show are these single-use halves, and invariably they also show from the vegetation that they were in milder, warmer episodes. And really that's one of the main features, that what we seem to have in this period, this, what is it, 38 to 43 is the maximum of the radiocarbon dates, is that we've got people, small groups of Phasmic Sea hunter-gatherers, leaving these using these Baradostian lithics, these Aurignacian type, European Upper Paleolithic type industries, visiting the caves, especially in these interstadial, warmer, slightly more humid conditions. And looking at the landscape today, this is a Shanidar cave. This actually is simply another province. It's not sea. This is just a modern map of from Shanidar. There's the cave with these Baradost mountains that it's in. And then there's a valley in beyond that. And then there are you move then up to the high mountains, up with to the Iranian and Turkish borders. And today, there are transhumant flocks, as indeed used to live in the shepherds used to live in the cave. They're down here in the winter, they were living in the cave. Now it's an archaeological reserve, so they don't. But the transhumant shepherds in winter are all around here, and in spring, and then they move up to the high mountains. And it looked from what Tim Reynolds has said with the lithics, that people just retooling. They're bringing their hunting equipment. They're camping in the cave for short periods, presumably moving on. The main animal they're killing was ibex, which you still find in the archaeological reserve today. And moving on, so short period visits. And then moving further down, we move into this area where we've done the larger excavations. And after a couple of years of excavations, we found some stray human bones in the sieves, which alerted us. And in the end, we found remains of Shanidar number 5. And this is the excavation here by Salecki. It was at the very end of his field work, and he knew that he'd only got part of the remains, and that's why one of the things going back. So it's no surprise. So our excavations were down here, and we were able to find remains. You see here the leg bones and the pelvis and so on. And Emma Pomeroy, who's a colleague in Cambridge, biological anthropologist and archaeologist, she was able to show, she's studying the remains and was able to show that, yes, it is definitely part of Shanidar number 5. So we've got the location of Shanidar 1, and we've got parts of Shanidar 5. And then moving underneath that, so Shanidar 5 is here, and underneath it, about 20, 30, 40 centimeters, we've got evidence for, one assumes, Neanderthal occupation, because it's below the Neanderthal burial. This is here. And what we found, again, are very, very similar sorts of evidence to that Baradostian, of little small hearths. That's the sections through the hearth. It looks like it may have stake holes around it. That's another trace of hearths near where the Shanidar 3 body was found. So it's very, very similar occupation evidence to the Baradostian. And all the paleoenvironmental indicators, again, it's people coming in this cold MIS3, this is, and coming in this cold, dry condition, but coming when it's broadly slightly warmer. When conditions are more or less like today, broadly, that's when people are coming into the cave. What we've also shown, these are a series of the radiocarbon dates. There isn't a 10,000 year hiatus. There are traces of occupation all the way through. So people are in the cave all the way through this period. You can see 50,000, 45,000, 40,000, all the way up through to those Baradostian layers. And what we're looking at here is one of the questions we still have to work on, is what are we actually looking at in terms of the archaeology, because Shanidar 5 was found in this sort of gully here. Above it is lithics that are Baradostian. Below it should be lithics that are, because it's below the Neanderthal, the hearth I showed you was over here. should be Mousterian. In fact, these are just taken from that transition zone from one small part. You can see Mousterian lithics, Baradosian lithics, and other cultural objects. Shanidar 5, the bones of the Neanderthal are there. This is one that he thought had been killed by rockfall, and it is in rockfall, but we definitely don't think they were killed by rockfall. We think the bodies are there, however placed. Anyway, so Shanidar 5 is there, and you can see Mousterian lithics underneath it in that, think of that previous picture, but there are Mousterian lithics stratified above it, and which say we think it's about 50,000. So if Neanderthals are still around after that, that's right. But there are Baradostian lithics also down below it as well as above, and mostly they're interdigitated. You can see there's a Mousterian layer with Mousterian lithics, then Baradostian. These are all tiny numbers, so it's very. One can't emphasize how small these samples are that we've got from those excavations. And then there are these beads, and you can see the beads are mostly above, but there's also one below. And going back to that same picture, that's the Shanidar, that's the Neanderthal, mostly Baradostian lithics. That's where we got those radiocarbon dates and all those first halves. That's one of these halves I showed you earlier. So the Baradostian archaeology is up here. There are Mousterian lithics above. There are Baradostian lithics down below. Most of these beads are above. They're just tiny little perforated shells, but there's one down below. It's stratified under a massive boulder. It's incredibly difficult to argue. There is evidence for animal burrowing. You can see that's one of these burrows there. It's very difficult to argue. So the transition zone, what's precisely going on between Neanderthals and non-humans is as yet very unclear. And as I say, unfortunately, we haven't got any modern human fossils to tie in with any of the archaeology yet. It's unfinished business. Then we get to, so we've gone down, then we get to the lower Neanderthal remains. So we've gone down through, we're looking at this archaeology here. Down through here is where he found this unique cluster of skeletal remains. Shanidar 4, when they found it, that's up here, this is Shanidar 3 and 5 up here from the 60s excavations. He is by Shanidar 4, down in the beginning of his deep sounding. They found the bones in a niche, and so of Shanidar 4, and this is where they took the sediment from the pollen. And then they encased the earth in plaster, and so they dug it out and removed it. An extraordinary, I mean, incredibly difficult to get it out. And the idea was to try and excavate it under laboratory conditions. And so it was taken, this coffin of earth was taken, got out of the cave, got down the mountains, got onto the roof of a taxi, taken some considerable distance to get onto the train, eventually got back to Baghdad. And when they opened the box, T. Stewart, who was the anthropologist, was rather horrified to find the whole thing inevitable. It was all jumbled up. So they then excavated what he could to try to work out what bones are there. And because they did think that they could see that there was a bone of somebody else in addition to Shanidar 4 in the part that they exposed. And this is how it was. The interpretation of these bones in this cluster. And you can remember how small actually that coffin-like thing was that they dug out. So most of the bones at the top were Shanidar 4. Things that didn't fit, they gave the number Shanidar 6. And there were one or two bones, this is both T. Stewart and then Eric Trinkhouse, who conducted the major study later of the bones. Because the last person said most of the bones are in Baghdad. Some in the Smithsonian, he was the last main study, he was the last person, Eric Trinkhouse, to look at all of this material. And you can see there we have Shanidar 4, Shanidar 6, one or two bones that didn't fit that, so they were called Shanidar 8, and then they also found bones of an infant. And as we got down into that deep sounding, we started seeing in section human bones, just brown human bones sticking out as we cleaned the section. There were occupation layers down here too, much richer than higher up. And we are getting down into these finer sediments, we are getting into MIS 5, when that climate is more like today, so a different climatic regime. But this particular stone is the stone that we're able to see. This is Ralph Salecki here. I think this is T. Stewart. He's got his hand on. So we are just, so where we're standing to take this picture is in fact where Shanidar 4 was. And so we were able then to excavate there. And this is what we call Shanidar Z, published in Antiquity in 2020, New Neanderthal Remains, paper led by Emma Pomeroy. And you can see how we found the flattened skull on the top left, but you can see you've got the orbit of the eye and the teeth still surviving. So it's flattened like a pizza. And when those bones were conserved and removed, underneath it were parts of the upper limbs, upper arms. Also, there's a lithic right there, though we don't think it's some strange ritual thing. We think it's just within the sediment. And then the following, so we're excavating different seasons, and underneath that is the rib cage and backbone. So we've got the upper body of an adult, we don't yet know male or female, Neanderthal, by this stone. And see if this works. I think I can, no, I don't think it will. Yeah, sorry about, yes, that was an animating reconstruction of it. And so Emma then has been trying to work out its relationships to these bodies and taking the Salecki photographs and trying to fit, and you can see here she said very approximate, but it does look that this is a photograph of the Shanidar 6 feet, the legs around here, and so on and so forth. And she's gone through the different bones that we're finding. And what she's beginning to think, that the priority is for her to get back to go and look at the bones in Baghdad when it's possible to do so. But it may be that those 4 and 6 allocations need adjusting. So it's possible that our Shanidar Z, the lower part of the body, must be part of that group. But whether, but it's not a simple case of, oh yes, it must be Shanidar 6, or yes, it must be Shanidar 8, because some fit, some bones, some don't. So if you like, so this identification of 6 and 8, sorry, and how our new body fits into that group has still to be sorted out, which is why she's calling it Shanidar Z. Well, was it a burial? Occupation evidence, this much denser occupation evidence, this is stuff with loads of charcoal and chunks of animal bone and so on. It's running right up. The body is in water lane, it's in the water lane channel. There's definitely water flowing through, but there are non-fluvial sediments amongst the bones and under the body, lining the channel. So, and there's also evidence for cuts, a cut at the side that the channel has been, and we can see it in the thin section that we have. We've got the fill, and then up here, you've got this zone of compaction and an abrupt stratigraphic contact and so on, and then the fill of the body, I was going to say grave, but it does indeed look that this channel is somehow enhanced, cut, that there is clear evidence that the people are making some sort of shape using a natural channel, but placing a body there. So it does look that this is a deliberate placing of a body. And indeed, tying in with that, some of the rocks also, they're all limestone, but they're very different from the rocks around. And all of the bodies, this tiny mass of bodies, they're all against it. They're in a kind of natural niche. There's a huge perpendicular rock here that had come down from the roof at some stage, and the bodies were were against it. So it's like a sort of mini rock shelter. And they do look like placed stones. This is that stone around that which we had little drawings of. It's a head on. It's not quite like a pillow, but it does look as if there are placed stones, which Salecki also talked about, that there may be some sort of grave markers. So we've got Shanidar 4, 6, 8, 9Z, but precisely how does 6, 8, 9Z relate to each other? Well, that's the infant. But also there are hints that there's a finger bone that doesn't fit, wrist bones that don't fit, there's an incisor that don't fit, and rib bones that don't fit underneath and around. So it's non-Shanidar Z material. So it's beginning to, I mean, say cemetery is a very, a term very relevant. One's got to be very careful about, but it does look like a unique collection of Neanderthals placed very interweaved almost. I mean, you see how our body, the legs were right down into where that, under that flower burial. So you can see this this quote from Paul Pettit when he talked about the case for Neanderthal burial, and he ended up saying, you can see here that some of these sites, Lortus, La Quina, La Ferracy, Crapina, these are all European sites, and Shanidar, imply the transition of mortuary traditions centered around a fixed point in the landscape that could be used, if not exclusively, to hide, process, and bury the dead. So the groups at La Ferracy and Shanidar, the dead had not quite departed. So there are a lot more questions to ask, but it does look like that it is a persistent place in the Neanderthal landscape, but to which also people are going there and living and leaving their occupation debris as well. And then we see the last point in this sequence is the lower bodies we just looked at are there, Shanidar 4. We did do this trench further down. We're into this moist indications of moist climate, MIS 5. The bodies are around 75 to 80,000 years from the OSL dates. Well, 75,000. We're probably down at 85,000, something like that, 90 down here. And we are at this, we think down here is this stalagmite layer. So there's all of this as yet unexplored. So questions for the next phase, and we couldn't go back through COVID, and we were hoping to go back this year and couldn't because of COVID, but we're hoping to go back for 2 seasons next year, and then 1 more season, the current funding, but a Templeton grant that's funding the field work. And there's also funding conservation work going on in Cambridge on the Shanidar remains. So we still therefore got that question, when were Neanderthals first there? Because we haven't got to the bottom of the sediment. When were modern humans first present? Can ancient DNA give us any sort of hint to add to the fossil record? Did they ever share the use of the cave? We have all these enigmatic evidences of that Shanidar 5, Baradostin, Mousterian material. Who's making what? And are they sharing the use of the cave? In principle, modern humans were around in the region for as long as Neanderthals, going back 100, 150,000 years ago from finds from caves in Israel. So in principle, there's no reason why it should be a Neanderthal sequence and a modern human sequence. It's more likely it is, but in principle it needn't be. And the transition is unclear. There clearly isn't this neat 10,000 year gap between the two. Did they use the cave for repeated deliberate burial? We're beginning to see that the answer probably is yes. But did they treat their dead in different ways? So these bodies, Shanidar 5, and we hope to expose Shanidar 3 next, the location. What's going on there where they're covered in rocks there? It looks like it's in the gully. It's probably not so much in situ, the Shanidar 5, I think it's come down. Is there a range of things that they're doing with their bodies, which would also fit when people say, did Neanderthals bury their dead? You've got to remember that it's a species from the Atlantic to the Urals and over almost 400,000 years. So it's presumably incredibly likely that they dealt with their dead in many, many different ways in the Neanderthal realm. And it's perfectly likely over the timescale we're dealing with in one particular cave they did. What was the timescale between mortuary events? That's one of those difficult questions you've got to try to tackle. In other words, that tightly clustered group of bones currently dated by OSL to around 75,000 years ago, what are the gaps between them? You know, is it measured in days, in months, years, centuries, millennia? So, you know, people are going back to these marked places, but what sort of timescales? Can we do anything about getting at that through things like microstratigraphy and so on? And then, of course, when and why did Neanderthals disappear? Still coming back to that Christian question, the more that we can reconstruct of the climate context of the cave, will that give us any hint? And the behavior that goes with it, will it give us, climate isn't a sort of silver bullet, but clearly it's a context of why they disappear. And the work fund that's going on in Cambridge, Emma is, we have a specialist conservator from one of the Spanish institutes working on lower Paleolithic remains there. And she's working on these remains because they're in a terrible fragmentary situation, but she's doing amazing things with them. And the starting point is the micro CT scanning. See that what we can see under the scanning, and this is before she's really done the cleaning, but we've got the potential number of questions that we can ask from the remains. The petrous bone we can see in the skull remains is surviving. It's not yet cleaned and open, but that's the best chance of getting ancient DNA. And the teeth, of course, there are all the studies that people now do on the kind of tartar on teeth, the plaque, and so on. So there's going to be a huge amount of information to come out about the diet of this Neanderthal, the health regime and the genetics and so on. So that's where we are. We're hoping to go back. And these are lots of acknowledgements and the funding that's given us the work so far. And also the people of Kurdistan. It's a site that's enormously important for them. There's not much knowledge about the detail. They only, one of the things we hope to try to do is get a visitor centre there. It's hugely visited in the spring season by people from Kurdistan. They come out from the capital Erbil, and it's the time when Kurds from all over Europe and so on will come back to visit families, all pre-COVID. And Shanidar is a high spot, so they know that it's a hugely important part of, you know, so it's part of a world heritage. It's also very much part of a Kurdish people's heritage, wrapped up, of course, with all the politics of Kurdistan. So thank you very much. That's where we are.
Wow, thank you very much, Graeme. That was a wonderful presentation of this iconic cave and your excavations that apply so many scientific methods that comprise modern archaeology and provide a lot of data on human environment interaction and so many other things, investigate questions like organized burial. So this new discovery of Shanidar C was quite fascinating in this regard. And then, of course, Shanidar was, during the time when I was a student, it was already one of those key sites and the knowledge that came out from Salecki excavations with this injured Neanderthal and the indication that he was really cared for and that they were caring of each other, the flower burial and so on. How is it with the flower burial? Is that still?
One thing I should have mentioned, actually, well, two things actually about it. One is that we have got flower pollen in the micromorphology sections that we've got through the Shanidar Z. So there's definitely vegetation down with the body. Now, whether it's flowers carefully laid or whether it's, you know, vegetation thrown over the body just to cover the body or ritually, I have no idea, but there is plant vegetation. There are plants down there with Shanidar Z. And one thing I should also add, when I first emailed Ralph Salecki in 2011 to ask for his blessing to say, would it be, you know, to go back to Shanidar, and say he was enormously enthusiastic, but also one of the things he said in his very first email, he said, and the flowers in spring are absolutely beautiful. And that last picture I showed you of the Kurd, you can see how green it was outside the cave. Well, there is a spring flush of grass, and it's only for about, when we've been digging there in in April, the beginning of April, end of March is horrible, cold, wet. There's snow on the mountains above. April is then this fabulous flush of grass and the flowers largely that are the flowers in the burial. And then from about the 1st of May, the transhumant sheep, the flocks, all start being taken up to the high mountains. And we were there for 1 week in the beginning of May, and you could just watch the grass beginning to turn yellow. So there's this very window of a flush of grass when that's the flowers. Now, Chris Hunt, my collaborator, had a PhD student who looked at one of the things she looked at was the present day pollen rain from how pollen gets into the cave today. And one of the things that came across is that one of the main vectors are tourist feet. You can see where the tourists come in and go around. That's where the flowers. So they're coming up through on the path, coming up, bringing the flower. So as he said, you could argue that the flowers in the Shanidar 4 pollen, did that pollen get there? Flowers were taken and laid there. Did it get there on Shanidar Neanderthals' feet as they walked up through the grass and got the body there? Or were they in the feet of Salecki and the workmen getting the body out? In the sense the jury's out. But given our finds of absolutely clear pollen in those burial sediments, not in this water lane, but in these sediments that are in and around the body. And Arlene wrote, she did consider all these possibilities, like, as you know, it was argued that little rodents could have brought the pollen down. She considered all of those. And we can see burrowing, and we've looked for, Chris's PhD student also looked for pollen in the burrows that we can see around the burial. So there's no doubt at all that there is burrowing as well. But it does look more and more likely that however involved, plant remains, vegetation is part of what they're doing with the bodies.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Ado, I think we have
whether we can solve it at the end, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'd say, just finally to add before we get to questions, is as you know, a lot of the so-called, the discoveries of Neanderthal burials, they go back, in some of them, to the beginning of the 19th century. So even if we end up with an unresolved area where people can still debate it, at least this is the first occasion where we can investigate, with all the modern methods, a burial context like this, and try to tease out the evidence, for and against, as openly as possible.
Yeah, particularly the Shanidar set was quite interesting in that way. So the different methods that would lead to the identification of Shanidar set for being really an organized barrier.
And if it is, it's interweaved. I mean, the lower part of the body, it looks like it's part of that group. You can see it's Shanidar 4, where it's a meter away, and the lower part of our body is in that coffin collection of soil that was taken to Baghdad. So whatever the time gap between them, bodies are clearly being taken, and they say it is a rather special place. There is this enormous column of rock that had come down from the cave roof, and the bodies are all placed in this kind of little shelter place against it. So it would have been very visible, and there are these markers. So without getting into speculation, and we only have this part of the cave to look at where Salecki dug, it does look as if body that it is that they're choosing a particular place for a series of bodies.
Ado, I think we have a number of questions for Graeme Barker.
Yes, we do, via the chat box. The first one is from Shihan Bestel. I think this is related to the slides on methods. He or she's asking, what are some of the specialist analysis that are being carried out? And has any ancient DNA been retrieved?
What was the first? I heard the ancient DNA. What was the first part?
What are some of the specialist analysis that are being carried out?
Well, I suppose the micromorphology is largely taking place in Cambridge. Chris Hunt is overseeing, he's at Liverpool John Moores, he's overseeing most of the paleo-environmental work, particularly he's doing pollen. And he's got a student who's also looking at some of the lithic microware, and a colleague of ours who's worked on previous projects. She's Josephina Mutri, she's now in Cyprus. She's been looking at the lithics to look at the organic residues and useware. So that's just a small part of them. In terms of the DNA, we took out a couple of fragments from Shanidar 5, and Eski Vilislav, who says he has a joint position between Cambridge and Copenhagen. His team have been trying to get ancient DNA out of those fragments, and we never had much hope for those because Shanidar 5 was exposed, and the way it was found, in fact, it was there was that black and white photograph, I may have shown it. The workmen were able to get down to get to the deep sounding. There was a path that they had walking down from the front of the cave down the side of the trench, and broadly that wear and tear on the path exposed some human bones that turned out to be Shanidar 5 right at the end. So Salecki knew it was a disturbed burial, and so we found some of these bones anyway. That was unsuccessful. Nothing survived. There is ancient DNA in the sediment, in the environmental DNA, the sediment samples we've taken. Eski says there is stuff there. It's not yet identified, but ancient DNA is surviving in the sediment, which will be a wonderful breakthrough, particularly if it survives in the better conditions down in those MIS5, those wetter sediments where Shanidar Z is. Anyway, and they're working on, well, they're not yet working on Shanidar Z because it's being conserved. And I should say that when the bones were found, the consistency of them, it was likened very aptly by one of the excavators to when you take a British digestive biscuit and stick it in a cup of tea, and it starts to, that's what the bone was like. And so Emma Pomeroy has conducted these exquisite excavations, exposing them where just a trowel would just cut them straight through, and then conserving them with the chemicals enough so they can be raised. And so now we've got the specialist conservation work going on in Cambridge. And so there's a whole queue of people lining up who want to work on the Shanidar Z remains for the sort of things we talked about, like the teeth studies and so on. And we can see in the CT scanning that the petrous bone survives. So it's not yet produced, it's not yet exposed now, but it's there. I showed one of those images. So that's going to be as good a chance as we'll get for getting ancient DNA out. So the work on Shanidar Z will go on for years. At the end, of course, restored, it should be back in, all of this material is obviously on loan. And at the end, it should be back in Iraqi Kurdistan.
It sounds like a lot of work. But we have a few more questions. One is from Sir Vernie Sagun. He's asking about the extinction of Neanderthals, but I think you explained in your presentation that a factor may be global warming. But he's actually asking if it is true, or is there truth that one of the reasons for their extinction is cannibalism?
I mean, one suspects there isn't a simple explanation. I mean, cannibalism, again, that there is evidence of cannibalism in the Neanderthal realm, that huge area, huge time period. But, you know, when you look at the ethnography of cannibalism, there's all manner of reasons that it's practiced, has been practiced in recent times, often, you know, to do with well, mostly highly ritualized. So, and we can't impose that simply on the back, but therefore, you know, it's one of the other aspects that is recorded in how Neanderthals sometimes, some places, dealt with their dead. Thinking now of COVID, people have often said that, well, did modern humans bring diseases into Eurasia from Africa that Neanderthals couldn't deal with? And we can all think of the example of the native populations of the Americas, and how decimated they were by diseases brought by Europeans. Now that's at the level at the moment of speculation, but with the advances in ancient DNA and the sort of molecular basis, you know, for years it's only been possible to look at the skeletal, the changes to bones and teeth to get at disease and health. Well, now the molecular record is such that it's feasible. So whether diseases, you know, were a factor, new diseases, inability to deal with them, that's also suggested. Because when you take the climate, there was rapid change then, but as you can see, you know, that Neanderthals had lived for years with whole, you know, they'd adapted to all sorts of climate change for a long time. So it still raised the point of why around 40,000, when it does appear to be relatively, I mean, within a few thousand years, they've gone. So climate, you know, it must be of their ability to deal with it. And people talk about the technologies they got, the degree of planning they got compared to modern humans. One of the other arguments is also that they were just getting too few and too scattered, that there could have been a whole range of inbreeding by the end. And so it sometimes just said that it was, you know, in the face of an extremely effective competitor, modern humans, an extremely effective competitor, you know. So you know, whether we can see, you know, whether you'd go as far as saying, you know, they were hunted out, I don't think anybody would say that. You know, and say clearly we have the other examples of interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans. So, you know, there's clearly a whole range of factors, but it still is surprising that it is within a 2,000 or 3,000 years over a huge area they seem to have gone. I mean, in Britain at the moment, we've had a, you know, population, the dominant population were red squirrels. Now the dominant population is grey squirrels, and red squirrels are a protected species in a few tiny islands of parts of the British Isles. And there's no hunting out, there's no mega climate change, you know, there's no, but actually the grey squirrels have proved to be much more effective. They're getting much more populous. The grey squirrels are getting much more, you know, smaller populations, inbred, more vulnerable. And so, you know, in a way, you can probably see that there could have been a range of tipping points in a species that in the end was probably very few in number and widely scattered, compared with a rapidly expanding and highly effective population of our own species. Well, really, you know, they're not entirely separate species.
Speaking of interbreeding, Sir Vernie also asked, are there other human features or diseases that are considered to be from Neanderthal genes?
I haven't heard that. I don't think so. You mean coming the other way? Diseases coming from Neanderthals? Is that what the question was?
Yeah, yes, it is. Yes, that's.
Yeah, I haven't heard that. But again, you know, it's, you know, the press love a kind of silver bullet, and I suppose, if you know, for most of us who are archaeologists, you know, we're trying to deal with a deep past with these tiny little bits of evidence, but to use all the evidence, you know, as much kind of, well, archaeological science and argument as we can, and just not get into speculation. But as I say, the exciting thing about the archaeology of disease is potentially the molecular thrust of the next decade will be particularly on those sorts of questions of can we get at disease traces out of modern humans as well? So it's a question where we may have something to say in a decade's time that we can't say at the moment.
All right. Let me take this time first to kindly acknowledge our faculty who's here. Ma'am Lisa is here, Dr. Tanya Ulden's here, and Sir Artie Milo is also here. In the meantime, I'll pass the mic to Dr. Pawlik.
Thank you, Aido. Also, our dean, Dr. Saloma, was joining the talk, but had to leave, of course, being very busy. And I think we have a follow-up question or comment from Vernie, saying, because there's debate that Neanderthals interbred with Homo sapiens, thus we have Neanderthal genes persisting in present-day populations.
What was the question?
Oh, now I lost it.
I mean, as we said,
regarding, I think that was regarding the possible diseases.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and there's still such a huge unknown of all of these species, and we know what Neanderthals look like. We sort of know what modern humans look like, but actually, the record at this early period of 40,000 is amazingly restricted. And do we know what Homo lucenensis look like? We've got some sense of what Flores might have looked like. Denisovans, what were they like? And then, given the evidence that we've got sort of some element of interbreeding and linkage between modern human, Neanderthal, Denisovan, presumably it's highly likely that, there could be hybrid populations that we know nothing about. Skeletally, we have no idea what they look like. And when you look at that whole complexity of the Chinese evidence as well, it just seems to me that it's a really exciting time, and one suspects that a lot of orthodoxies will be transformed, and it just gets more and more interesting of why 100,000 years ago it looks like there are several species. That's the genetics, the fossil record too, but could there also be hybrid versions of these as well? We don't know. That there's some evidence of this interbreeding between some of them, where we've got the bones in these cold caves, and they're not there now, apart from these tiny percentage of DNA in all of us, of Neanderthal. So it gets more and more agmatic and more interesting. I think it's also very important, but it's also very important to, I think archaeologists, are often capable of, we fall into a trap, if you like, of regarding the archaeological record as a record just of success. And now obviously you could say the Neanderthal record is a record in the end of failure, but it was 400,000 years of success before. And I think also, as many of us would say, and you've written too, Alfred, that the whole debates about modern humans, sometimes just underneath all the archaeological science, there's an almost religious sense of we're dealing with a very special being compared to these others. And and as many people studying these people say, that there were a variety of ways of being human, not one special way. And that becomes even more interesting, therefore, why our particular species, with our ways of being human, in the end proved in evolution terms more successful. But but I think it is say that there were a variety of ways of being human, and that's a far better way to try to approach this complex fossil and genetic record. And as archaeologists, the fossils are interesting, the genes are interesting, but of course we're mostly interested in behavior.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And we have quite a lot of evidence that suggests that what was considered back in 80s, 90s, or even after that as modern human traits and part of the modern package that was supposedly to have arrived with Homo sapiens, Neanderthals had quite a number of those technologies and behaviors.
Yep. And Southeast Asia, generally, is one of the most exciting areas, which in some ways, it's done more to change how archaeologists working on modern humans and Neanderthals had to rethink about what we're looking at, given the range of evidence, then these new species, and you start to therefore realize you can't, the normal equations, when you think most archaeological sites of this period, they haven't got the fossil remains. So we end up with these assumptions about who's making the material. An island, Southeast Asia was one of the first major regions where people realized, well, it's a lot more complicated than that. And we have, easy stories about modern humans expanding across the region. And, when you think of the number of sites with actual fossils to say who's making the material that we're talking about, it's fractional, and even more so, of course, in Europe. And as you say, modern Neanderthals tried a range of these technologies.
Yeah, I darkly remember several years ago I met Eric Trinkhaus in Bonn. So he was working on that Magdalenian double burial from Bonn Oberkassel, and that was at the Landesmuseum in Bonn, where also the type fossils of Neanderthal man is placed and exhibited. And I was doing a very small user analysis of lithics from that site. And I hope I remember it right, but I think he was saying something like when asked about what is actually the difference between Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, or first Homo sapiens that would probably meet with Neanderthals or arrive in Europe shortly after. And then he would say something like the difference, the morphological difference between Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens fossils is, in his opinion, actually less than the difference between early Homo sapiens and Neolithic Homo sapiens.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. And indeed, I'm sure, again, that a next decade will bring out even more. But I mean, again, the African record, we talk about, well, it's modern humans. Well, is it? And if it is, what's the range of variation in the modern human population in Africa? 300,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago, and indeed, just like you said, Neanderthals tried some of these technologies in modern humans. Well, of course, modern humans in Africa are using Neanderthal type technologies for for a very long time and so on. So many people have said that too, that there's we have a simplistic image of a particular kind of modern human in Africa, which is the basis for modern humans coming out of Africa, which is almost entirely unbelievably simplistic. There could well be a range of variation in those sorts of periods across Africa that we have very little knowledge about. We get slight intimations from the fossil records, and similar that other variabilities spanning across into Eurasia. So I think that kind of model, if you've got a species and it thought like this and it behaved like this and it looked like this in Africa, and then wonderful arrows come whizzing out in different periods and come all the way across to the Philippines, Australia, and eventually into America. That chart I showed you, it makes for an easy story, a simple story. But the one thing we've learned about the human story is that simple stories are almost very wrong stories. And if so, in a sense, first of all, we're learning that the behaviors going on at the end of those arrows was actually much more complicated. The fossil record is much more complicated at the end of the arrows that nature papers have. Now there's all this accumulating evidence that the out of Africa and back to Africa movements are hugely more complicated than this idea of a so-called failed expansion of modern humans into Israel and the Levant at 120,000, 50,000, and then a successful one, right across the rest. That's, it's clearly hugely more complicated than that from the work by people like Mike Petraglia in Arabia, with indications also that there might have been Neanderthals down there too, conceivably. I mean, Ellen Scary is arguing that some of the lithics down in Arabia, wouldn't be all that surprising. And so, in a sense, the story is moving back into this simple basis from which modern humans come. Actually, almost certainly it's a hugely variable story there, in fossil terms and behavioral terms.
Right. Yeah.
It's reassuring how little we know, I think. If you're a student, think you're getting into archaeology, it's a magnificent time to get in terms of both the questions, the orthodoxies, which are being seen as a state of the art, which is going to be our students' jobs to demolish, and the prospects. It's an exciting time.
It is. It is. What do you think of the Iberian cave art that has been dated to around 65,000 and times of Neanderthals?
Yeah, I mean, so what do you think? I mean, the dates are pretty good. I mean, they're dates, isn't it? They're kind of sandwich dates where you get dates. The rock, I mean, the flowstone underneath, the flowstone over. So, I think
the first impulse would be questioning the dates, but they seem to be pretty solid.
Yeah, and from such a we've had such a focus of stories, and then you have and now also you've got all the antiquity of art systems all over Southeast Asia, Ireland, Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. Who's making that? We have all sorts of assumptions about who's making it. But they're assumptions. So it wouldn't. I mean, to me, it seems perfectly reasonable that Neanderthal populations at that sort of time are doing what they're doing with those symbols. I mean, clearly, it's a very different order of the kind of things from the amazing later Upper Paleolithic cave art in France and Spain.
Right.
It fits into a package of variability and complexity. They say a lot of other things fit into, which makes the demise even more interesting.
Yeah. Very true, yeah. And there's not so much fossil evidence for early Homo sapiens in Europe at around that time, at this 50,000, 40,000 years ago.
Yeah, most of the modern humans are much, much later.
Yeah.
And we've moved into this, it's modern humans, 43,000, all the big dating programs, in they come. And actually it's almost entirely on lithics. Then of course you have the Greek finds of some modern human fossil much, much earlier. So we have on the one hand that, and on the other hand, yes, most of the European skeletal material is much later. So, I would thought it's an open question, what these people look like, these people that were in Europe at 40,000. Whether they would have looked significantly different, similar to when you see these images, these reconstructions of Neanderthal man and modern human woman or whatever, they're always shown as hugely different. But as from that Trinkhouse quote again, well, they're largely based on later versions of how we looked.
Yeah, very true. I in this regard, I really like that picture you showed at the beginning of the Neanderthal in the suit, the one that's displayed in the Neanderthal Museum. I'm not sure about the knife. I would even have given him a cell phone.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a picture of my father, and there was an image in a textbook I remember of a Neanderthal wearing a sort of trilby and a double-breasted suit, looked just like my father. So yeah, it's always said that would you've noticed that the woman image, in that same slide, there was an exhibition on Neanderthals in Paris a few years ago, and they came out of the exhibition into the bookshop. There was a huge pile of the exhibition book with this lovely lady standing behind, dressed in Agnes B, who's a Parisian designer. That's the cardigan that she's wearing, and it's a Neanderthal reconstruction wearing French designer clothes. And you walk and you suddenly then realize, and indeed I have a PhD student and I'm with her, and she came out and said, my God, it looks just like my sister. Yeah.
So probably Eric Trinkhaus was not that wrong.
No. I think they've often said that, that extreme version of, the big eye ridges, the skull and face, they're certain sorts of period, but many are much less, as it were, developed like that, just as from what we can see of the archaic modern humans, they're all pretty archaic. So it's not really my specialism, but I, from that, what he says rings completely true.
Edo, do we have any further questions?
None at the moment.
Okay, all right. And well, we are actually still very good in time. We are only 4 minutes past, and most of the people have stayed with us. So if there are no further questions for Professor Barker, then I guess the last thing that I'm going to do is to briefly announce our next webinar. And there's an academic break coming week, so our next talk will be on November 9. And we will then welcome Dr. Glenn Summerhayes from the University of Otago in New Zealand. And he will discuss the role of mainland New Guinea in the spread of Lapita. Okay, so that's, I think, all from my side. Thank you very much, Graeme, for this wonderful talk and for this wonderful afternoon, or well, rather early morning at your place.
Breakfast now.
Sorry for really making you wake up and be on video so early. But
It's a
really,
pleasure.
thank you so much. It's
Pleasure
really
to talk about the project.
wonderful. All right, then thank you very much again. Thanks for coming, and hope to see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you, and bye-bye.